I'm Mark Golub, and election 2016 is finally drawing to a close, as Americans throughout the country will be deciding whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump becomes the next president of the United States, and whether the United States Senate will remain Republican or will have a Democratic majority for the first time in 6 years, and whether the House of Representatives will continue to have a Republican majority, or whether enough Democrats will be elected to Congress to overturn the current Republican majority. It's almost over. What's been characterized by many as the ugliest, most unpleasant presidential election in recent history, maybe in all of American history. Though I must say, I seem to remember hearing this same mantra in prior elections and in prior primary elections. I don't know how many of you remember the tenor of the contest between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton 8 years ago. But however you remember past elections, and whatever you may feel about this one, virtually every person I speak with is just so happy that the election is finally here and will soon be over, in part because both candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, have historically low, unfavorable numbers. So many Americans seem prepared to vote for the candidate they feel is the lesser of the two evils. So where do things stand this election day? While there's a plethora of polls which form little consensus among them, they do seem to show that Hillary Clinton has a 4 to 5 point lead over Donald Trump. Real Clear Politics electoral map shows Clinton leading Trump by 39 electoral votes, but there are 171 electoral votes still up for grabs. Pundits now do say they can see a path for Trump reaching that magic number of 270 electoral votes, but they also point out that for Trump to win, he would need to carry all the states won 4 years ago by Mitt Romney, and then sweep all of the toss-up states, including Florida. He'd have to win either Pennsylvania or Virginia, and a number of smaller states as well. And with the Hispanic vote apparently coming out in record numbers in early voting, and people assume the Hispanic vote is going overwhelmingly to Hillary Clinton, it appears very unlikely that Donald Trump will be able to win all the states Mitt Romney won, win all the toss-up states, and in addition, gain at least 15 more electoral votes by winning no fewer than one major state that seems now to be safely on the Democratic side of the ledger. As for the Senate, it's a real horse race, with Real Clear Politics showing that each party has 46 Senate seats pretty well locked up, while 8 seats still are up for grabs. Assuming a Hillary Clinton White House, the Democrats would need to win 4 of those 8 toss-up Senate seats, giving them 50 seats, and then they'd have a vice presidential tiebreaker. In the House, on the other hand, it looks very unlikely the Republicans will lose control. Real Clear Politics has the GOP holding 224 seats to the Democrats' 190, with only 21 House seats in play. Even if the Democrats won all 21 of those toss-up seats, they would still be some 13 seats short. So, if things shake out as the polls are predicting, Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States for the next 4 years, with a Republican House and maybe a Democratic Senate. And what's it all mean for the Jews? Where is the American Jewish community in all of the political drama that has dominated the American scene, if not the world political stage, for the last period of months? Well, for some answers, I'm so pleased to be joined yet once again by the outstanding Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Ron Kampeas, who's been doing some outstanding work this entire political season, reflecting the thinking and, in some instances, the political machinations of American Jewry. And Ron, thanks so much for giving us some time once again here on JBS.
Sure, always a pleasure.
So, Ron, you heard my description of where things stand. Do you see anything differently than I described?
No, I think you have it absolutely right. I think that there's a slight, the odds are slightly in Clinton's favor, and certainly the Senate is a toss up. A week and a half ago, it was different. Clinton seemed absolutely certain to get the presidency, and she looked as if she was good. The Democrats were going to get the Senate as well, but then the whole email thing resurrected, and that's affected her, and it's kind of died down now, with the FBI director once again saying that there would be no charges against her because of her use of a private email server when she was Secretary of State. But I don't think she's recovered enough to have the lead that she had then.
Do you expect her to win a large enough majority to call it a mandate?
Yeah, I think that. That's hard to say. I think if she wins outright, if she wins more than the 270 electoral votes, she'll be able to call it a mandate. I think there's going to be a consensus on both sides of the political divide that it's a mandate. You're going to have some resistance if it's a Republican Senate to a lot of her legislative initiatives. There's already talk of blocking any Supreme Court judges for the full 4 years, but that comes from even within the Senate, that comes from the far right of the Republican Party, the Ted Cruz right of the Republican Party. But I think generally she'll be perceived as having a mandate. I think Americans and Republicans outside of Trump Republicans, and those are two distinct entities, are going to want to move on if she gets more than 270 electoral votes, and vice versa. I think that's the same thing. The same is true of Trump.
Okay, I almost understand what you mean. A candidate has to win 270 electoral votes. The real question is, do they win more than 300? Do they win 320, 340? And does the losing candidate have in the hundreds rather than the 200s? It seems to me hard to say either candidate would have a mandate if they didn't do better than 300. You're using the 270 number, and I'm wondering why.
I think because a win is a win. History has a way of showing that. I mean, even in the first, look, the most contentious presidential election in recent history was in 2000 with Bush v. Gore, and even in the 9 months preceding September 11th, of course, September 11th brought drove George Bush's popularity ratings very high. But even before then, he was already taking far-reaching steps. I mean, he froze Israeli-Palestinian talks, in our little bailiwick. He started reconstructing government in the way he wanted to reconstruct government. And they behaved as if they had a mandate, and they had every right to. They were the declared winners of the presidential election. The one area that they lost the Senate in their first 6 months, but it didn't stop Bush from forging ahead with his agenda. If you win, you win.
Okay. Look, Ron, you and I have talked many times over these months, and again, but are you glad, Ron, we're near the end?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I think everybody's glad. This
has
been a very exhausting election.
Yeah. You and I have spoken many times now about how the American Jewish community tends to vote. They tend to vote 70% or more Democratic. Mm-hmm. And that it's the Orthodox community which tends to some extent to support a Republican candidate. Do you see any reason to think this election will be any different?
No, I think it's just going to be more so, at least on the Democratic side. I think that there's going to be, I think that Donald Trump, according to the last poll that was taken, and that was before the famous tape where he seemed to be acknowledging sexual harassment, that poll was in September, and it was 61 for Clinton, 19 for Trump. What's interesting is that Clinton's numbers are also relatively low. As you say, Barack Obama scored 69% in the last election, and that was down from 75 to 78 in 2008 among Jewish voters. And as you pointed out, the same thing is true of Jews as of the general population. Both candidates are incredibly unpopular, so she's not scoring very high. But I think that the negatives truly are with Trump, and I think that's going to be more so. I think that probably you're going to find a majority of the Orthodox also voting for the Republican candidate, as you have in every election since 2000, at least since 2004. I think in 2000 it was more of a 50-50 split, and I think that there's going to be some distaste. Anecdotally, again, there are no polls to show us anything, but I was in Florida in the Orthodox Jewish community in Miami Beach. My colleague Ben Sales was in Cleveland in the Orthodox Jewish community of Beechwood, and we're sensing people voting for Trump, not because they like them, but because they dislike Clinton more. But
Yes.
there's not a great deal of enthusiasm for Trump. That's anecdotal, but that's what we found.
Yes. And by the way, that's very honest of you, and the audience should understand very often all a journalist has is anecdotal information. Sometimes there are polls, although it's interesting, Ron, so many polls have different results. Yet one has now the uneasy feeling that polls are also politically driven. But I experienced what you've experienced. We televised a debate from Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan, an Orthodox, sitting up modern Orthodox synagogue, and Ruth Messenger represented Hillary Clinton, and I'm suddenly blocking. I knew the name as I walked in here. A very esteemed lawyer represented Donald Trump. The audience, interestingly enough, was in favor of Donald Trump. And by the way, the control room has reminded me it was Ken Abramowitz who represented Donald Trump. And what surprised me was not that there was applause for Ken's comments, but there was no applause for Ruth Messenger. Normally, Ron, that's associated with the Orthodox community's tremendous support for the state of Israel and a concern that the Democratic Party, especially the Democratic left, will not be as strong on Israel as any Republican candidate. How do you see this divide, and what is it that, from your perspective, motivates the Orthodox community's support for Donald Trump?
I think, as you say, there's a perception that the Democratic Party is drifting away from Israel, and to the degree that that's real, it has to do with the grassroots. It has to do with diminishing enthusiasm for Israel among the grassroots. I think that there's Hillary Clinton, in terms of her own foreign policy, in terms of her Senate career, in terms of her statements, I think it's fairly certain that she's going to live up to her pledge, which was implicit at first, has become more explicit in recent weeks, that she's going to seek to repair ties with the Netanyahu government that were frayed by the arguments that Benjamin Netanyahu had with President Obama. I think that's real. I think that, but once that is coupled with the perception that Clinton will say what needs to be said to achieve her goal, in this case, getting elected, there's skepticism about that in the Orthodox community. I think that we'll see what happens if she's elected and how she behaves towards Israel. I have a feeling that, come 2020, if she's up for re-election, a lot of those fears will probably be assuaged to a certain degree. If she doesn't want to deal, she's got enough on her plate in her first year in office. She's not going to want to deal with a parlous relationship with Israel, I'm fairly certain. But like I said, the fraught diplomatic relations with Israel, between Israel and the United States under President Obama, plus the distrust that Hillary Clinton fairly or unfairly arouses in voters, have coupled to to drive, I think, Orthodox Jews more towards Donald Trump, who has said, more recently, at least since his AIPAC speech in March, has said the right things, the things that reassure right-wing pro-Israel voters.
By the way, this is something else you and I have spoken about from the beginning of the time we began covering this election cycle. It's almost as if Israel has disappeared. It was not part of any of the three debates to any significant extent at all. I don't hear either candidate addressing the Middle East beyond ISIS and fighting the war against Islamic terrorism, but I don't hear anybody discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And most Jews, when are asked, do you know what Donald Trump thinks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Do you know what Hillary thinks? People will tell me, we don't know what Donald thinks, and all we know is Hillary gave Netanyahu a what for at one point while she was Secretary of State, and we don't know if she's going to be any different once she's elected than President Obama. But I have been struck, Ron, by the extent to which in this election cycle, Israel has almost been invisible, and I'm thinking to myself, maybe that's a good thing. What's your sense?
I think you're absolutely right, except for the, as it relates to the Iran deal. That's come up a lot. It came up particularly in the vice presidential debate, which is interesting because both players in that debate have a much more unabashed stake in the different sides of the Iran deal. Mike Pence is much more emphatically against the Iran deal than Donald Trump has been. Although Donald Trump's rhetoric has been strong on the Iran deal, he's interestingly shied away from saying that he would scrap it. Mike Pence is in the scrap it school. Trump has never said that, and his two Jewish advisors put out a paper recently on his Middle East policy. They also said that he didn't say that he would scrap it. The language they used to talk about it was to try and reform it within its existing parameters. Hillary Clinton also, obviously a backer of the Iran deal. She talks about how she helped shape it, but she always casts herself in terms of that as the bad cop. I'm the one who brought the sanctions, which brought the Iran deal, brought Iran to the table. Tim Kaine, a much more enthusiastic backer of the Iran deal. So it's interesting. You see the difference between, I think, between the presidential candidates and their running mates. You see that the actual differences between the candidates and their parties as well.
Yeah.
The Democrats much more bullish about the Iran deal. The Republican than Hillary Clinton is. Republicans much more bullish about killing it than Donald Trump is.
Yes, that's right. By the way, Ron, I seem to be on every political mailing list. Based on the emails I receive every day, you'd think I was on a first-name basis with Hillary and Michelle and Barack and Joe. But I also receive emails from Donald and Eric, and now a group that calls itself Jews for Trump. What do you know about that organization, Ron?
Yeah, I frankly haven't heard of it. I mean, I know that there are Jews for Trump. I've seen various iterations. There was a famous incident of the guy who started rabbis for Trump, and then when nobody would join him, changed him to rabbi.
Yes. Yes.
Bernard Rosenberg. And then, and there are other Jews like Jeff Balaban who have been emphatically for Trump. But, you have, I don't know exactly how Kenneth Abramowitz presented himself, but there was another forum in northern New Jersey recently where Jeff Berkowitz, who was a longtime Republican activist, took the Trump side and said during the debate, look, Trump is a horrible candidate. This is an interesting election in terms of people, particularly in the Jewish community, conservatives, Republicans, coming toward Trump, but in the most reluctant and difficult of ways. So to actually have an organization, Jews for Trump, that's interesting. I wonder how many people it represents.
Yeah. And by the way, what you say is very insightful. Everyone should, I think everybody does understand. You have more people voting for a candidate because they believe the other candidate is simply unacceptable. And then when people are voting for Trump, it's because they just believe you can't have Hillary as president. When people are voting for Hillary, many times they'll say to me, there are things about her that trouble me, but you can't have Trump.
Right.
And so it's a very unusual election in that regard.
Yeah.
By the way, what do you say to people when the issue of where Israel falls in the priority list for an American Jew going to the polls? In other words, there are some Jews who will say, not only the most important issue, the only issue that will drive me towards one candidate or another is their stand on Israel, because I believe Israel is facing existential danger. The United States is not facing existential danger. The worst thing that happens is we get a president who's not so good for 4 years. But if we have the wrong president for Israel, Israel could suffer really irreparable harm. And therefore, there are people who say Israel is not simply my top priority, it is my only priority. For you, and again, you're a journalist who's writing in the Jewish community all the time. And I don't know how often you're asked specifically this question, but I'd love to hear your perspective. What would you say to an American Jew who cares passionately about Israel and also wants the United States to have the best president possible? How does a Jew today balance those two interests?
I think the way that they've balanced them in the past, like I've said before, the president, it's interesting. You look at the American Jewish Committee polls year in, year out, including the most recent one in September, and their top issues are the economy and jobs and national security, terrorism. Israel ranks 6th or 7th or 8th. But then you get around to the question, how important is Israel to you? And you get a vast majority saying important or very important. And so that seems to be a contradiction, but it's not. What it is, it's the anomaly is that I think most Jews, when they go into the polling booth, they say, does the candidate I favor on a bunch of domestic issues meet the threshold on Israel? In other words, will he be okay on Israel? And this has been the case with every presidential candidate from Mondale Reagan in 1984 through Barack Obama in 2012. Yeah, John McCain was probably better on Israel. Mitt Romney was probably better on Israel. Barack Obama met the threshold. The last president who maybe didn't meet the threshold, although I think there were complicating factors, was Jimmy Carter in 1980, and that drove a majority of Jews away from voting Democratic. So you saw the. So that's the that's the answer I give. I think what's interesting about this election in terms of the other type of voter, the minority, although I think that they're perceived as being more than they are, the people who say, I will only vote for Israel. Israel is my only issue. I just did a story that went up today on Jews who are really spooked by the whole Trump phenomenon. And I spoke to a young woman. I just put a notice out on social media. Do you want to talk to me about the election and whether it's changed your perceptions of Jews in the American landscape? A lot of people volunteered to speak. And one young woman said, I used to just sort of take on the pro-Israel line by rote. I would repeat it. That was fine with me. But now when I hear people telling me, you have to vote for Trump because he's going to be better for Israel, I have to question that. And she's 28 because she says, really, from my perspective, Donald Trump is so bad for the United States. You're telling me that I have to vote for him anyway because of Israel? That leads me to question all the pieties, all the conventional wisdoms on the pro-Israel position. So I think that can be that a position, vote only for Israel, it can be alienating to a certain kind of voter. And so it's one I would advise people to think about.
That was very interesting. One more question for you. We're almost out of time. You're the Jewish media in the United States. I want to hear what you believe the media's role in elections are, both the secular media and you and I who are in Jewish media. And I'm going to tell you my perspective, and you have every right to give me a different one. I believe our job, your job and my job, I believe the job of CNN, of MSNBC, of Fox, of ABC, NBC, CBS, their job is to report the news and to give as much information to the voter as possible without trying to skew the election one way or another, without trying to push one candidate or another, even if they believe a candidate is dangerous for the United States. If an anchor thinks a candidate is bad for America, that's his or her own concern. But the job you and I have, and the job of, again, the secular media, is give us the information so we as individuals can make a decision. We have in the Jewish world Jewish organs which have now endorsed Donald Trump. There are some which even, I believe, are nonprofit. I don't understand how they can endorse a candidate to begin with.
Right.
But I'm asking you what your feeling is about Jewish media and the role we do or do not play during election coverage. It's been something I've been talking to you about for now virtually an entire year. But Ron, that's how we're going to end this conversation. Tell me what you believe our role is as we cover an election.
I think you're exactly right. I think the instance you talked about a newspaper endorsing him, it is true. That's interesting because it is a nonprofit. How do they figure that one out? I'm not sure. But that's that they see themselves, I'd imagine, as just a typical sort of firewall between the editorial side and the reporting side. The Wall Street Journal is a deeply conservative newspaper in terms of its editorial opinions, but its reporting is straight up, and I think would hew to the conventions that you just described for reporters. I would add, I think that as much as you're right, you just have to present the facts as they are. You shouldn't be reluctant to present facts for that might harm a candidate just because it's going to anger his or her opponents. And that goes for the aggressive reporting on the email scandal. But a couple of weeks ago, I got a lot of flack because of Donald Trump's speech in West Palm Beach, in which he used terms that were seemed borrowed word for word from anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but he didn't mention the Jews. He just mentioned the conspiracy theories. I pointed that out. People are saying, "What are you trying to hurt him?" But no, I'm saying this is extraordinary. I have never heard of a major American presidential candidate using this kind of terminology. It's worthwhile presenting to my readers that he has used this terminology. So yeah, it's a difficult line to hew, but I would agree with you absolutely.
Ron, I've told you before, I tell you every time I see you are doing fabulous work, and you've done some work with real integrity over the course of this election season. One more day, and all we can do is then do a post-mortem of this. But I always am so grateful of the time you give us, and I'm so glad I can share your thoughts with the JBS audience. You be well, and we'll speak after the election.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you. The thoughts of Ron Kampeas, Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. It's been a long election season, my friends, but it'll be over in only a matter of hours. And we'll have post-election analysis from a Jewish perspective later this week right here on JBS. I hope you'll be with us. My thanks as always to our director Sloan Copeland, production coordinator Serge Goldberg, editor Dennis Golan, to JBS's associate director Dara Golub, and to the producer of Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.